an introduction to that famous gentleman Don Quixote of the Mancha. This is the story that Miguel de Cervantes, Spaniard, published in 1605, which the world has been reading again and again ever since. Once upon a time there lived in a certain village in a province of Spain called the Mancha, a gentleman named Quixada or Quisida, for indeed historians differ about this, whose house was full of old lances, halberds, and such other armors and weapons. He was, besides, the owner of an ancient target or shield, a raw-boned steed, and a swift greyhound. His pot consisted daily of common meats, some lentils on Fridays, and perhaps a roast pigeon for Sunday's dinner. His dress was a black suit with velvet breeches, and slippers of the same color, which he kept for holidays, and a suit of homespun which he wore on weekdays. On the purchase of these few things he spent the small rents that came to him every year. He had in his house a woman servant of about some 40 years old, a niece not yet 20, and a lad that served him both in field and at home, and could saddle his horse or manage a pruning hook. The master himself was about 50 years old, a strong, hard-featured man with a withered face. He was an early riser, and had once been very fond of hunting. But now, for a great portion of the year, he applied himself wholly to reading the old books of knighthood, and this with such keen delight that he forgot all about the pleasures of the chase, and neglected all household matters. His mania and folly grew to such a pitch that he sold many acres of his lands to buy books of the exploits and adventures of the knights of old. These he took for true and correct histories, and when his friends the curate of the village, or Mr. Nicholas the worthy barber of the town, came to see him, he would dispute with them as to which of the knights of romance had done the greatest deeds. So eagerly did he plunge into the reading of these books that he many times spent whole days and nights poring over them, and in the end, through little sleep and much reading, his brain became tired, and he fairly lost his wits. His fancy was filled with those things that he read, of enchantments, quarrels, battles, challenges, wounds, wooings, loves, tempests, and other impossible follies, and those romantic tales so firmly took hold of him that he believed no history to be so certain and sincere as they were. Finally, his wit being extinguished, he was seized with one of the strangest whims that ever madman stumbled on in this world. For it seemed to him right and necessary that he himself should become a knight-errant, and ride through the world in arms to seek adventures and practice in person all that he had read about the knights of old. Therefore he resolved that he would make a name for himself by revenging the injuries of others, and courting all manner of dangers and difficulties, until in the end he should be rewarded for his valor in arms by the crown of some mighty empire. And first of all he caused certain old rusty arms that belonged to his great-grandfather, and had lain for many years neglected and forgotten in a by-corner of his house, to be brought out and well scoured. He trimmed them and dressed them as well as he could, and then saw that they had something wanting, for instead of a proper helmet they had only a morion or headpiece, like a steel bonnet without any visor. This his industry supplied, for he made a visor for his helmet by patching and pasting certain papers together, and this pasteboard fitted to the morion gave it all the appearance of a real helmet. Then, to make sure that it was strong enough, he out with his sword and gave it a blow or two, and with the very first did quite undo that which had cost him a week to make. He did not at all approve the ease with which it was destroyed, and to make things better he placed certain iron bars within it in such a manner that made him feel sure it was now sound and strong, without putting it to a second trial. He next visited his horse, who, though he had more corners than a Spanish real or shilling, which in those days was anything but round, and had nothing on him but skin and bone, yet he seemed to him a better steed than Bucephalus, the noble animal that carried Alexander the Great when he went to battle. He spent 4 days inventing a name for his horse, saying to himself that it was not fit that so famous a knight's horse and so good a beast should want a known name. Therefore he tried to find a name that should both give people some notion of what he had been before he was the steed of a knight-errant, and also what he now was. For seeing that his lord and master was going to change his calling, it was only right that his horse should have a new name, famous and high-sounding and worthy of his new position in life. And after having chosen, made up, put aside, and thrown over any number of names as not coming up to his idea, he finally hit upon Rosinante, a name in his opinion sublime and well-sounding, expressing in a word what he had been when he was a simple carriage horse, and what was expected of him in his new dignity. The name being thus given to his horse, he made up his mind to give himself a name also, and in that thought labored another 8 days. Finally, he determined to call himself Don Quixote, which has made people think that his name was Quisada and not Quesada, as others have said. And remembering that the great knights of olden time were not satisfied with a mere dry name, but added to it the name of their kingdom or country, so he, like a good knight, added to his own that also of his province, and called himself Don Quixote of the Mancha, whereby he declared his birthplace, and did honor to his country by taking it for his country, by taking it for his surname. His armor being scoured, his morion transformed into a helmet, his horse named, and himself furnished with a new name, he considered that now he wanted nothing but a lady on whom he might bestow his service and affection. For, he said to himself, remembering what he had read in the books of knightly adventures, if I should, by good hap, encounter with some giant, as knights-errant ordinarily do, and if I should overthrow him with one blow to the ground, or cut him with a stroke in 2 halves, or finally overcome and make him yield to me, it would be only right and proper that I should have some lady to whom I might present him. Then would he, entering my sweet lady's presence, say unto her with a humble and submissive voice, Madam, I am the giant Caraculiambro, lord of the island called Malandrania, whom the never too much praised knight Don Quixote of the Mancha hath overcome in single combat. He hath commanded me to present myself to your greatness, that it may please your highness to dispose of me according to your liking. You may believe that the heart of the knight danced for joy when he made that grand speech, and he was even more pleased when he had found out one whom he might call his lady. For, they say, there lived in the next village to his own a hale, buxom country wench with whom he was sometime in love, though for the matter of that she had never known of it or taken any notice of him whatever. She was called Aldonca Lorenzo, and her he thought fittest to honor as the lady of his fancy. Then he began to search about in his mind for a name that should not vary too much from her own, but should at the same time show people that she was a princess or lady of quality. Thus it was that he called her Dulcinea of Toboso, a name sufficiently strange, romantic, and musical for the lady of so brave a knight. And now, having taken to himself both armor, horse, and lady fair, he was ready to go forth and seek adventures. Chapter 2. Of the first sally that Don Quixote made to seek adventures. All his preparations being made, he could no longer resist the desire of carrying out his plans, his head being full of the wrongs he intended to put right, the errors he wished to amend, and the evil deeds he felt himself called upon to punish. And therefore, without telling any living creature and unseen of anybody, somewhat before daybreak, it being one of the warmest days in July, he armed himself from head to foot, mounted on Rosinante, laced on his strange helmet, gathered up his target, seized his lance, and through the back door of his yard sallied forth into the fields, marvelously cheerful and content to see how easily he had started on his new career. But scarcely was he clear of the village when he was struck by a terrible thought, and one which did well nigh overthrow all his plans. For he recollected that he had never been knighted, and therefore, according to the laws of knighthood, neither could he nor ought he to combat with any knight. And even if he were a knight, he remembered to have read that, as a new knight, he ought to wear white armor without any device upon his shield until he should win it by force of arms. These thoughts made him waver a little in his plan, but more for the reason that his head was full of his folly than for any other. He determined to cause himself to be knighted by the first he met, as others had done of whom he had read in the books which had so turned his brain. As to the white armor, he resolved at the first opportunity to scour his own until it should be whiter than ermine, and, having satisfied himself with these intentions, he pursued his way without following any other road than that which his horse was pleased to choose, believing that to be the most correct way of meeting with knightly adventures. And as he rode along, he exclaimed to the empty air, as if he had been actually in love, "O Princess Dulcinea, lady of this captive heart, much wrong hast thou done me by dismissing me and reproaching me with thy cruel commandment not to appear before thy beauty. I pray thee, sweet lady, to remember this thy faithful slave, who for thy love suffers so many tortures." 1,000 other ravings, after the style and manner that his books had taught him, did he add to this as he travelled along, meeting with no adventure worthy to be set down, whilst the sun mounted so swiftly and with so great heat that it would have been sufficient to have melted his brains if he had had any left. He journeyed all that day long, and at night both he and his horse were tired and marvellously pressed by hunger, and looking about him on every side to see whether he could discover any castle to which he might retire for the night, he saw an inn near unto the highway on which he travelled, which was as welcome a sight to him as if he had seen a guiding star. Then, spurring his horse, he rode towards it as fast as he might, and arrived there much about nightfall. There stood by chance at the inn door 2 jolly peasant women who were travelling towards Seville with some carriers, who happened to take up their lodging in that inn the same evening. And as our knight-errant believed all that he saw or heard to take place in the same manner as he had read in his books, he no sooner saw the inn than he fancied it to be a castle with 4 turrets and pinnacles of shining silver, with a drawbridge, a deep moat, and all such things as belong to grand castles. Drawing slowly towards it, he checked Rosinante with the bridle when he was close to the inn, and rested a while to see if any dwarf would mount on the battlements to give warning with the sound of a trumpet how some knight did approach the castle. But seeing they stayed so long, and Rosinante was eager to get up to his stable, he went to the inn door, and there beheld the 2 wenches that stood at it, whom he supposed to be 2 beautiful damsels or lovely ladies that did solace themselves before the castle gates. At that moment it happened that a certain swineherd, as he gathered together his hogs, blew the horn which was wont to bring them together, and at once Don Quixote imagined it was some dwarf who gave notice of his arrival, and he rode up to the inn door with marvellous delight. The ladies, when they beheld one armed in that manner with lance and target, made haste to run into the inn. But Don Quixote, seeing their fear by their flight, lifted up his pasteboard visor, showed his withered and dusky face, and spoke to them thus: "Let not your ladyships fly, nor fear any harm, for it does not belong to the order of knighthood which I profess to wrong anybody, much less such high-born damsels as your appearance shows you to be." The wenches looked at him very earnestly, and sought with their eyes for his face, which the ill-fashioned helmet concealed, but when they heard themselves called high-born damsels, they could not contain their laughter, which was so loud that Don Quixote was quite ashamed of them, and rebuked them, saying, "Modesty is a comely ornament of the beautiful, and too much laughter springing from trifles is great folly. But I do not tell you this to make you the more ashamed, for my desire is none other than to do you all the honor and service I may." This speech merely increased their laughter, and with it his anger, which would have passed all bounds if the innkeeper had not come out at this instant. Now this innkeeper was a man of exceeding fatness, and therefore, as some think, of a very peaceable disposition. And when he saw that strange figure armed in such fantastic armor, he was very nearly keeping the 2 women company in their merriment and laughter. But being afraid of the owner of such a lance and target, he resolved to behave civilly for fear of what might happen, and thus addressed him, "Sir Knight, if your worship do seek for lodging, we have no bed at liberty, but you shall find all other things in abundance." To which Don Quixote, noting the humility of the constable of the castle, for such he took him to be, replied, "Anything, Sir Constable, may serve me, for my arms are my dress, and the battlefield is my bed." While he was speaking, the innkeeper laid hand on Don Quixote's stirrup and helped him to alight. This he did with great difficulty and pain, for he had not eaten a crumb all that day. He then bade the innkeeper have special care of his horse, saying he was one of the best animals that ever ate bread. The innkeeper looked at Rocinante again and again, but he did not seem to him half so good as Don Quixote valued him. However, he led him civilly to the stable, and returned to find his guest in the hands of the high-born damsels who were helping him off with his armor. They had taken off his back and breastplates, but they could in no way get his head and neck out of the strange, ill-fashioned helmet which he had fastened on with green ribands. Now these knots were so impossible to untie that the wenches would have cut them, but this Don Quixote would not agree to. Therefore he remained all the night with his helmet on, and looked the drollest and strangest figure you could imagine. And he was now so pleased with the women, whom he still took to be ladies and dames of the castle, that he said to them, "Never was knight so well attended on and served by ladies as was Don Quixote." When he departed from his village, damsels attended on him, and princesses on his horse. "O ladies, Rocinante is the name of my steed, and I am called Don Quixote, and the time shall come when your ladyships may command me, and I obey, and then the valor of mine arm shall discover the desire I have to do you service." The women could make nothing of his talk, but asked him if he would eat, and Don Quixote replying that such was his desire, there was straightway laid a table at the inn door. The host brought out a portion of badly boiled haddocks, and a black greasy loaf which was all the inn could supply. But the manner of Don Quixote's eating was the best sport in the world, for with his helmet on he could put nothing into his mouth himself if others did not help him to find his way, and therefore one of the wenches served his turn at that and helped to feed him. But they could not give him drink after that manner, and he would have remained dry forever if the innkeeper had not bored a cane, and putting one end in his mouth, poured the wine down the other. And all this he suffered rather than cut the ribands of his helmet. And as he sat at supper, the swineherd again sounded his horn, and Don Quixote was still firm in the belief that he was in some famous castle where he was served with music, and that the stale haddock was fresh trout, the bread of the finest flour, the two wenches high-born damsels, and the innkeeper the constable of the castle. Thus he thought his career of knight-errant was well begun, but he was still greatly troubled by the thought that he was not yet dubbed knight, and could not therefore rightly follow his adventures until he received the honor of knighthood. Thought. Chapter 3. Of the pleasant manner of the knighting of Don Quixote. When he had finished his sorry supper, he took his host with him to the stable, and shutting the door, threw himself down upon his knees before him, saying, "I will never rise from this place where I am, Sir Constable, until your courtesy shall grant unto me a boon that I mean to demand of you, something which will add to your renown and to the profit of all the human race." The innkeeper, seeing his guest at his feet and hearing him speak these words, stood confounded at the sight, not knowing what he would say or do next, and tried to make him arise. But all was in vain until he had promised him that he would grant him any gift that he sought at his hands. "Señor," said Don Quixote, rising from his knees, "I did never expect less from your great magnificence, and now I will tell you that the boon which I demand of you, and which you have so generously granted, is that tomorrow in the morning you will dub me knight. This night I will watch mine armor in the chapel of your castle, and in the morning, as I have said, the rest of my desires shall be fulfilled. that I may set out in a proper manner throughout the 4 parts of the world to seek adventures to the benefit of the poor and needy, as is the duty of knighthood and of knights errant. The innkeeper, who was a bit of a jester, and had before thought that the wits of his guest were none of the best, was sure that his suspicions were true when he heard him speak in this manner. And in order to enjoy a joke at his expense, he resolved to fall in with his humor, and told him that there was great reason in what he desired, which was only natural and proper in a knight of such worth as he seemed to be. He added further that there was no chapel in his castle where he might watch his arms, for he had broken it down to build it up anew. But, nevertheless, he knew well that in a case of necessity they might be watched in any other place, and therefore he might watch them that night in the lower court of the castle, where in the morning he, the innkeeper, would perform all the proper ceremonies, so that he should be made not only a dubbed knight, but such a one as should not have a fellow in the whole universe. The innkeeper now gave orders that Don Quixote should watch his armor in a great yard that lay near unto one side of the inn, wherefore he gathered together all his arms, laid them on a cistern near to a well, and buckling on his target he laid hold of his lance and walked up and down before the cistern very demurely until night came down upon the scene. In the meantime the roguish innkeeper told all the rest that lodged in the inn of the folly of his guest, the watching of his arms, and the knighthood which he expected to receive. They all wondered very much at so strange a kind of folly, and going out to behold him from a distance, they saw that sometimes he marched to and fro with a quiet gesture. Other times, leaning upon his lance, he looked upon his armor for a good space of time without beholding any other thing save his arms. Although it was now night, yet was the moon so clear that everything which the knight did was easily seen by all beholders. And now one of the carriers that lodged in the inn resolved to give his mule some water, and for that purpose it was necessary to move Don Quixote's armor that lay on the cistern. Seeing the carrier approach, Don Quixote called to him in a loud voice, "O thou, whosoever thou art, bold knight, who dares to touch the armor of the bravest adventurer that ever girded sword, look well what thou doest, and touch them not if thou meanest not to leave thy life in payment for thy meddling." The carrier took no notice of these words, though it were better for him if he had, but laying hold of the armor threw it piece by piece into the middle of the yard. When Don Quixote saw this, he lifted up his eyes towards heaven, and addressing his thoughts, as it seemed, to his lady Dulcinea, he said, "Assist me, dear lady, in this insult offered to thy vassal, and let not thy favor and protection fail me in this my first adventure." Uttering these and other such words, he let slip his target or shield, and lifting up his lance with both hands, he gave the carrier so round a knock on his pate that it overthrew him onto the ground, and if he had caught him a second, he would not have needed any surgeon to cure him. This done, he gathered up his armor again, and laying the pieces where they had been before, he began walking up and down near them with as much quietness as he did at first. But very soon afterwards another carrier, without knowing what had happened, for his companion yet lay on the ground, came also to give his mules water, and coming to take away the armor to get at the cistern, Don Quixote let slip again his target, and lifting his lance brought it down on the carrier's head, which he broke in several places. All the people in the inn, and amongst them the innkeeper, came running out when they heard the noise. And Don Quixote, seeing them, seized his target, and, drawing his sword, cried aloud, "O lady of all beauty, now, if ever, is the time for thee to turn the eyes of thy greatness on thy captive knight who is on the eve of so marvelous great an adventure." Saying this seemed to fill him with so great a courage that if he had been assaulted by all the carriers in the universe, he would not have retreated one step. The companions of the wounded men, seeing their fellows in so evil a plight, began to rain stones on Don Quixote from a distance, who defended himself as well as he might with his target, and durst not leave the cistern lest he should appear to abandon his arms. The innkeeper cried to them to let him alone, for he had already told them that he was mad. But all the time Don Quixote cried out louder than the innkeeper, calling them all disloyal men and traitors, and that the lord of the castle was a treacherous and bad knight to allow them to use a knight-errant so basely, and if he had only received the order of knighthood he would have punished him soundly for his treason. Then calling to the carriers, he said, "As for you base and rascally ruffians, you are beneath my notice. Throw at me, approach, draw near, and do me all the hurt you may, for you shall ere long receive the reward of your insolence." These words, which he spoke with great spirit and boldness, struck a terrible fear into all those who assaulted him, and, partly moved by his threats and partly persuaded by the innkeeper, they left off throwing stones at him, and he allowed them to carry away the wounded men, while he returned to his watch with great quietness and gravity. The innkeeper did not very much like Don Quixote's pranks, and therefore determined to shorten the ceremony and give him the order of knighthood at once before anyone else was injured. Approaching him, therefore, he made apologies for the insolence of the base fellows who had thrown stones at him, and explained that it was not with his consent, and that he thought them well punished for their impudence. He added that it was not necessary for Don Quixote to watch his armor any more, because the chief point of being knighted was to receive the stroke of the sword on the neck and shoulder, and that ceremony he was ready to perform at once. All this Don Quixote readily believed, and answered that he was most eager to obey him, and requested him to finish everything as speedily as possible. For, he said, as soon as he was knighted, if he was assaulted again, he intended not to leave one person alive in all the castle, except those which the constable should command, whom he would spare for his sake. The innkeeper, alarmed at what he said, and fearing lest he should carry out his threat, set about the ceremony without delay. He brought out his day-book, in which he wrote down the accounts of the hay and straw which he sold to carriers who came to the inn, and attended by a small boy holding the end of a candle and walking before him, and followed by the two women who were staying at the inn, he approached Don Quixote. He solemnly commanded him to kneel upon his knees, while he mumbled something which he pretended to read out of the book that he held in his hand. Then he gave him a good blow on the neck, and after that another sound thwack over the shoulders with his own sword, always as he did so, continuing to mumble and murmur as though he were reading something out of his book. This being done, he commanded one of the damsels to gird on his sword, which she did with much grace and cleverness. And it was with difficulty that they all kept from laughing during this absurd ceremony, but what they had already seen of Don Quixote's fury made them careful not to annoy him even by a smile. When she had girded on his sword, the damsel said, "May you be a fortunate knight, and meet with good success in all your adventures." Don Quixote asked her how she was called, that he might know to whom he was obliged for the favors he had received. She answered with great humility that she was named Tolosa, and was a butcher's daughter of Toledo. Don Quixote replied, requesting her to call herself from henceforth the Lady Tolosa, which she promised to perform. The other damsel buckled on his spurs, and when Don Quixote asked her name, she told him it was Molinera, and that she was daughter of an honest miller of Antequera. Don Quixote entreated her also to call herself Lady Molinera, and offered her new services and favors. These strange and never-before-seen ceremonies being ended, Don Quixote could not rest until he was mounted on horseback that he might go to seek adventures. He therefore caused Rocinante to be instantly saddled, leaped on his back, and embracing the innkeeper, thanked him in 1,000 wild and ridiculous ways for the great favor he had done him in dubbing him knight. The innkeeper, who was only eager to be rid of him without delay, answered him in the same fashion, and let him march off without demanding from him a single farthing for his food or lodging. Chapter 4. Of what befell our knight when he left the inn. It was dawn when Don Quixote went out from the inn, so full of pleasure to behold himself knighted that his very horse girths were ready to burst for joy. but calling to memory some advice that the innkeeper had given him about the necessity of carrying with him money and clean shirts when he went on his adventures, he determined to return to his house and obtain these things, and also find for himself a squire. For this office he fixed in his own mind upon a ploughman, a neighbor of his, a poor man who had many children, but yet a man who was very fit as he thought to be his squire. With this view he turned Rosinante towards his own village, who, knowing that he was on his way home, began to trot along with so good a will that he seemed not to touch the ground. He had not travelled far when he heard from a thicket hard by the shrill cries of some weak and delicate mortal in grievous distress. No sooner did he hear them than he exclaimed, "I am indeed thankful for the favor done to me by giving me so soon an opportunity of performing what is due to my profession and gathering the fruits of my desires. These cries doubtless come from some distressed man or woman who has need of my protection and aid." Then, turning the reins, he guided Rosinante towards the place whence the voice seemed to proceed. And within a few paces after he had entered into the thicket, he saw a mare tied up to one oak, and to another was tied a youth, all naked from the middle upward, of about 15 years of age. Now it was he that cried so pitifully, and not without cause, for a sturdy fellow of a farmer was beating him soundly with a girdle, accompanying each stroke with a reproof and piece of advice, saying, "The tongue must peace and the eyes be wary." And the boy, whose name was Andrew, answered, "I will never do it again, good master, I will never do it again. I promise to have more care of your things from henceforth." Seeing what passed, Don Quixote cried out with an angry voice, "Ill it beseems you, discourteous knight, to deal thus with one that cannot defend himself. Mount therefore on horseback and take thy lance," for the farmer had a lance leaning against the very same tree to which his mare was tied. "For I will make thee know that it is the act of a coward to do that which thou dost." The farmer, beholding this strange figure buckled in armor and brandishing a lance over his head, gave himself up for a dead man, and answered him with mild and submissive words, saying, "Sir knight, the youth whom I am beating is mine own servant, and keepeth for me a flock of sheep. But he is grown so negligent that he loseth one of them every other day, and because I correct him for his carelessness and knavery, he says I do it through covetousness and knavery. He says I do it through covetousness and miserliness, so as not to pay him his due wages, but on my conscience I assure you he lies." "What? The lie in my presence, rascally clown?" cried Don Quixote. "By the sun that shines above us, I will run thee through and through with my lance, base carler. Pay him instantly without another word, or I will finish and destroy thee in a moment. Loose him forthwith." The farmer, hanging down his head, made no reply, but released poor Andrew, of whom Don Quixote demanded how much his master owed him. The boy answered that it was 9 months' wages at 7 reals a month. Casting it up, Don Quixote found that it amounted to 63 reals, and commanded the farmer to pay the money at once, unless he had a mind to die for it. This the farmer, who was in a terrible fright, promised to do, but said he, "The worst of it is, Sir Knight, that I have no money here. Let Andrew come with me to my house, and I will pay him his wages to the last reel." "I go with him," said the boy. "Evil befall me if I do." "No, sir, I don't intend to do that, for as soon as ever we were alone he would flay me alive." "He will not dare to do it," said Don Quixote, "for my command is sufficient to make him respect me. And on condition that he will swear to me to carry out his promise by the order of knighthood which he hath received, I will set him free and assure thee of the payment." "Good your worship," said the youth, "mark well what you say, for this man my master is no knight, nor did he ever receive any order of knighthood. He is John Haududo the Rich, and lives at Quintanar." "That is no matter," said Don Quixote, "for there may be knights of the Haududos." "The good knight speaks well, friend Andrew," said his master. Do me but the pleasure to come with me, and I swear by all the orders of knighthood that are in the world to pay thee as I have said to the last reel." "With this," said Don Quixote, "I will rest satisfied, and see that thou fulfillest it as thou hast sworn. If not, I swear again to thee by the same oath to return and seek thee out once more and chastise thee. And I will find thee out, though thou didst hide thyself closer than a lizard. And if thou desirest to know who it is that commands thee thus, know that I am the valiant Don Quixote of the Mancha, the righter of wrongs and the scourge of injustice." Saying this, the knight clapped spurs to his Rocinante and was quickly gone from him. The farmer followed him with his eyes, and seeing that he was beyond the wood and quite out of sight, he returned to Andrew and said, "Come to me, child, for I will pay thee what I owe thee, as that righter of wrongs hath commanded." "Upon my word," said Andrew, "you do well to fulfill the good knight's commandments. And I pray that he may live 1,000 years, for he is so brave and so just a judge that, if you pay me not, he will come back and do all he promised." "I also do believe the same," said the farmer. "But for the much love I bear thee, I will increase the debt that I may add to the payment." And seizing him by the arm, he tied him again to the oak, where he gave him so many blows as to leave him for dead. "Call now, Master Andrew," said he, "for thy righter of wrongs, and thou shalt see that he cannot undo this, though I think I have not finished the doing of it, for I have yet a desire to flay thee alive as thou didst fear." But he untied him at last, and gave him leave to go and seek out his judge, to the end that he might execute the sentence he had pronounced. Andrew departed somewhat discontented, swearing to search for the valiant Don Quixote of the Mancha, and relate to him point for point all that had passed, that the farmer might be repaid sevenfold. Nevertheless he wept as he went along, and his master remained behind laughing, and thus did the valiant Don Quixote right this wrong. As for the knight, it appeared to him that he had made a very happy and noble beginning to his feats of arms, and as he rode towards his village he recited to himself in a low voice these words, "Well mayest thou call thyself happy above all other women of the earth, above all beauties, beautiful Dulcinea of Toboso, since it has fallen to thy lot to hold submissive to thy will a knight so renowned and valorous as is and ever shall be Don Quixote of the Mancha, who, as all the world knows, but yesterday received the order of knighthood, and today hath destroyed the greatest outrage and wrong that injustice and cruelty could commit. Today hath he wrested the scourge from the hand of the pitiless foe who so cruelly beat the delicate infant." Soon afterwards he came to a spot where the road branched into four, and there came into his fancy the crossways he had read of, where the knights errant used to ponder which of the roads they should take. And that he might imitate them, he let slip the reins on Rocinante's neck, submitting his will to that of his steed, who followed his first intention, which was to return home to his own stable. And having travelled some 2 miles, Don Quixote discovered a great troop of people, who, as it was afterwards known, were certain merchants of Toledo, that rode towards Murcia to buy silks. They were 6 in number, and came with their parasols or sun umbrellas, and 4 serving men, a horseback, and 3 lackeys. Scarce had Don Quixote perceived them, when he straight imagined them to be a new adventure. And so that he might imitate as far as possible the passages which he had read in his books, he settled himself with a gallant air and resolute bearing firmly in his stirrups, grasped his lance, brought his target over his breast, and stood waiting posted in the middle of the road for those whom he took to be knights errant like himself. And when they were so near that they might hear and see him, he lifted up his voice and said, "Let all the world stand and pass no further, if all the world will not confess that there is not in all the world a more beautiful damsel than the Empress of the Mancha, the peerless Dulcinea of Toboso." The merchant stopped at the sound of these words to behold the marvelous and ridiculous shape of him that spake them, and at once suspected the madness of the speaker. Curious to know the meaning of the confession he demanded from them, one of the merchants, who was a bit of a wag and very sharp-witted, said to Don Quixote, "Sir Knight, we know not who that good lady may be you speak of. Show her, therefore, to us, and if she be as beautiful as you report, we will, with right good will, and without further trouble, confess the truth of what you demand." "If I did show her to you," replied Don Quixote, "what merit would there be in confessing a truth which is clear to all beholders? The importance of my demand is that without seeing her you must believe it, which if you refuse to do, I challenge you all to battle, ye proud preposterous crew. And now come on, one by one as the order of knighthood requires, or all at once as is the custom and base usage of those of your breed. Here I await you, confiding in the right I have on my side." "Sir Knight," replied the merchant, "I request you in the name of all the princes here present, that in order that we may not burden our conscience by confessing a thing which we have never beheld nor heard, you will be pleased to show us some portrait of the lady, although it be no bigger than a grain of wheat. For I do believe that we are already so much on your side that though her portrait showed her to us a squint of one eye and wearing a hump on her back, we should say all that you wish in her favor." "Infamous rabble," replied Don Quixote, mightily enraged. "She is neither crook-eyed nor hump-backed, but is straighter than a spindle of Guatemala. Dearly shall you pay for the foul words you have uttered against so immense a beauty as my lady." So saying, he lowered his lance against him who had spoken, with such wrath and fury that if Rocinante had not tripped and fallen in the midst of his career, it would have fared ill with the rash merchant. But alas! Rocinante fell, his master went rolling some distance across the field, and though he struggled to arise, yet was he never able, so encumbered was he by his lance, target, spurs, helmet, and the weight of his old-fashioned armor. And while he strove to rise, he shouted, "Fly not, cowardly brood! Tarry a little, ye base caitiffs, for not by any fault of mine, but of my horse, am I thus discomfited." One of the lackeys with the company, hearing these saucy speeches of the poor overthrown knight, could not forbear returning him an answer on his ribs, and coming up to him he seized his lance, and having broken it into pieces, began with one of them to belabor him, so that in spite of his armor he pounded him like wheat in a mill. His masters called out to him to let the gentleman be, but the lackey was angry and would not give up the game. And running for the other pieces of the broken lance, he shivered them all over the poor fallen knight, who never closed his mouth but cried out against them for brigands and murderers, for such he took them to be. At last the lackey was tired out, and the merchants followed on their way, talking about the poor belabored knight, who, when he saw himself alone, again made trial to arise. But if he could not do so when sound and well, how could he after being pounded and almost beaten to a jelly? And yet he still considered himself fortunate, for he persuaded himself that this disgrace was one of those things that must of occasion happen to a knight-errant. And though he could not rise on account of being mauled and bruised from head to foot, he put it all down to the carelessness of his steed Rocinante. Chapter 5. How Don Quixote returned home, and what happened to his library, and how he sallied forth a second time to seek adventures. Finding that he was unable to stir, the knight pleased himself whilst lying on the ground by remembering and repeating aloud passages from his favorite books. He was reciting the ballad of the Marquis of Mantua, in which a noble knight has an adventure similar to his own, when there chanced to pass by a laboring man, a neighbor of Don Quixote's, who was going to take a load of wheat to the mill. He, seeing a man stretched on the ground, came over to him and asked who he was and what mishap had befallen him. Don Quixote at once believed that the laborer was no other than the Marquis of Mantua himself, and went on with his ballad, which gave an account of his disgrace. The laborer was astonished at all these follies, and taking off the knight's visor, which was all broken to pieces with the beating, he wiped his face, which was covered with dust, and when he had wiped it he recognized him and cried, "Signor Quixada!" For so was he named before he became a knight-errant who has brought your worship to this plight. But the knight only went on with his ballad and made no answer. Seeing this, the good man took off as well as he could his breastplate and corselet to see if he had any wound, but he found no blood nor sign of any. He tried to raise him from the ground, which he did at last with much ado. Then he mounted him upon his ass, which seemed a safer carriage than the knight's steed. Gathering up his arms even to the fragments of the lance, he fastened them upon Rocinante, whose bridle he took hold of, as well as of the ass's halter, and so they journeyed towards the village, Don Quixote continuing to mutter his nonsensical stories. In this manner they arrived at last at their village about sunset, but the laborer waited until it grew somewhat dusk, so that folk should not see the knight so simply mounted. When he entered the village and went to Don Quixote's house, he found all in uproar there. For the curate and the barber, Don Quixote's great friends, were there, and his housekeeper was crying to them at the top of her voice, "What think ye has befallen my master?" For 2 days both he and his horse, together with the target, lance, and armor, have been missing. Woe is me! I am certain those horrid books of knighthood have turned his brain, for I have often heard him say that he would become a knight-errant and go and seek adventures throughout the world. And Don Quixote's niece, who was there also, said to Master Nicholas the barber, "And indeed I have known my dear uncle continue reading these unhappy books of disadventures 2 days and 2 nights together." At the end of which, throwing down the book, he would lay hand on his sword and would fall a slashing of the walls. And when he was wearied, he would say that he had slain 4 giants as great as 4 towers. And I take great blame to myself that I did not tell you all this before, that you might have burned those wretched books which have caused all the mischief. "So I say too," said the curate, "and tomorrow they shall feed the flames so that they may do no further harm." By this time the laborer and Don Quixote had come to the house, and all the household hearing them arrive, ran to embrace him. And Don Quixote, who had not yet dismounted from the ass, for he was not able, said, "Stand still and touch me not, for I return very sore wounded and hurt through the fault of my steed. Carry me to bed, and summon, if it be possible, the wise Urganda, that she may examine and cure my wounds." "Come, my dear master," said his housekeeper, "and welcome, for, without sending for that Urganda, we shall know how to cure thee well enough. Accursed, say I once again, and 100 times accursed, may those books of knighthood be which have brought you to such a pass." With that, they bore him up to his bed, and searching for his wounds could not find any. Then he said he was all one bruise, through having a grievous fall with his horse Rocinante, in a fight with 10 giants, the most enormous and the boldest that could be found on earth. "So ho," said the curate, "there are giants about, are there? By mine honesty I will burn them all before tomorrow night." The next day, while the knight was asleep, the curate asked the niece for the keys of the library, which she gave him with a very good will. Then they all went in, the housekeeper with them, and found more than 100 very large volumes well bound, besides other smaller ones. The curate asked the barber to hand him down the books from their shelves one by one, that he might see whether any deserved to escape the fire. "No, no," cried the niece, "you ought not to pardon any of them, seeing they have all been offenders. Better fling them all out of the window into the yard and make a heap of them, and then make a bonfire of them where the smoke will offend nobody." With that the housekeeper caught hold of some of the largest and flung them out of the window. But the curate took down several from the shelves and began to examine them carefully, whilst the women cried out for their destruction. Whilst they were thus busied, Don Quixote began to cry aloud, saying, this way, valorous knights! Show the force of your valiant arms, lest we lose the tournament." Called away by this noise and clamor, they left the books and ran to Don Quixote, who had risen from his bed and was repeating his outcries and ravings, cutting about with his sword all over the room with slashes and backstrokes, as wide awake as if he had never been asleep. Wherefore, taking him up in their arms, they returned him by main force into his bed. With some difficulty they persuaded him to rest where he was, and after he had eaten his breakfast he fell asleep once again. That same night the housekeeper set fire to and burned all the books in the yard, and some went to the flames that had no harm in them, and thus was fulfilled the old proverb, "The saint sometimes pays for the sinner." Now, one of the remedies which the curate and the barber suggested for their friend's malady was to wall up and close his library, so that when he rose he should not find the books, and they might tell him the enchanters had carried them off, room and all. This was done, and when 2 days afterwards Don Quixote rose from his bed, the first thing he did was to go and visit his books. Not finding the library where he had left it, he went from one corner of the house to the other, looking for it. Sometimes he came to the place where the door had been, and felt it with his hands, then would turn his eyes up and down, here and there, to seek it, without speaking a word. But at last he asked the housekeeper where his library was. She, being well schooled what she should answer, replied, "What library? There is neither library nor books in this house now, for an enchanter has carried them all away." "Yes, dear uncle," said his niece, "while you were away, an enchanter came upon a cloud, and, alighting from a serpent on which he was riding, entered the library, and what he did therein I know not. But within a while after he fled out at the roof of the house, and left all the place full of smoke, and when we went to see what he had done we found neither room nor books." "This must be the work of the learned enchanter Freston," replied Don Quixote seriously, "a great enemy of mine who has a grudge against me, for he knows through his arts and his learning that I am in course of time to fight and vanquish in single combat a knight whom he favors. But I tell him it is useless to oppose what is decreed." "Who doubts that, dear uncle?" said his niece. "But why mix yourself up in these quarrels? Better stay at home peacefully, for remember the proverb says, 'Many who go for wool come back shorn.'" "Oh, niece of mine," said Don Quixote, "how little dost thou understand the matter. Before I am shorn I will pluck the beards of all who think to touch but a hair of me." To these words the women made no reply, because they saw his anger increase. For 15 days after this he remained quietly at home, without showing any signs of repeating his follies, and during this time he had many arguments with his friends, the curate and the barber, about his favorite knights errant. At the same time he was persuading a certain laborer, his neighbor, an honest man, but one of very shallow wit, to go away with him and serve him as squire. In the end, he gave him so many fair words and promises that the poor fellow determined to go with him. Don Quixote, among other things, told him that he ought to be very pleased to depart with him, for at some time or other an adventure might befall which should, in the twinkling of an eye, win him an island, and leave him governor thereof. On the faith of these and other like promises, Sancho Panza, for so he was called, forsook his wife and children, and took service as squire to his neighbor. Don Quixote then set about to provide himself with money. This he did by selling one thing, pawning another, and making bad bargains all round. At last he got a pretty sum, and having patched up his broken helmet as best he could, he told Sancho Panza the day and hour on which he meant to start. He also charged him to provide himself with a wallet, which Sancho promised to do, and said that he also meant to take a very good ass named Dapple along with him, which he had of his own, because he was not used to travel much afoot. In the matter of the ass, Don Quixote hesitated a little, calling to mind whether ever he had read that any knight-errant was ever attended by a squire mounted on ass-back, but no such case occurred to his memory. Nevertheless, he decided that the ass should be taken, with the intention of providing his squire with a more dignified mount when he had a chance, by unhorsing the first discourteous knight he met with. All this being arranged, Sancho Panza, without bidding his wife and children farewell, and Don Quixote, without saying goodbye to his housekeeper and niece, sallied forth from the village one night, unknown to any person living. They traveled so far that night that at daybreak they were safe against discovery, even if they were pursued. And Sancho Panza rode along on his beast like a patriarch with his wallet and bottle, full of a huge desire to see himself governor of the island which his master had promised him. Chapter 6. Of the dreadful and never-to-be-imagined adventure of the windmills, and of the fearful battle which the gallant Biscayan fought with Don Quixote. Whilst they were journeying along, Sancho Panza said to his master, "I pray you have good care, Sir Knight, that you forget not that government of the island which you have promised me, for I shall be able to govern it, be it never so great." And Don Quixote replied, "Thou must understand, friend Sancho, that it was a custom very much used by ancient knights errant to make their squires governors of the islands and kingdoms they conquered, and I am resolved that so good a custom shall be kept up by me. And if thou livest and I live, it may well be that I might conquer a kingdom within 6 days and crown thee king of it." "By the same token," said Sancho Panza, "if I were a king, then should Joan my wife become a queen and my children princes." "Who doubts of that?" said Don Quixote. "That do I," replied Sancho Panza, "for I am fully persuaded that though it rained kingdoms down upon the earth, none of them would sit well on my wife Joan. She is not worth a farthing for a queen. She might scrape through as a countess, but I have my doubts of that." As they were talking, they caught sight of some 30 or 40 windmills on a plain. As soon as Don Quixote saw them, he said to his squire, "Fortune is guiding our affairs better than we could desire. For behold, friend Sancho, how there appear 30 or 40 monstrous giants with whom I mean to do battle and take all their lives. With their spoils we will begin to be rich, for this is fair war, and it is doing great service to clear away these evil fellows from off the face of the earth." "What giants?" said Sancho, amazed. "Those thou seest there," replied his master with the long arms. "Take care, sir," cried Sancho, "for those we see yonder are not giants but windmills, and those things which seem to be arms are their sails, which being whirled round by the wind make the mill go." "It is clear," answered Don Quixote, "that thou art not yet experienced in the matter of adventures." "They are giants, and if thou art afraid, get thee away home, whilst I enter into cruel and unequal battle with them." So saying, he clapped spurs to Rocinante, without heeding the cries by which Sancho Panza warned him that he was going to encounter not giants but windmills. For he would neither listen to Sancho's outcries nor mark what he said, but shouted to the windmills in a loud voice, "Fly not, cowards and vile creatures, for it is only one knight that assaults you." A slight breeze having sprung up at this moment, the great sail-arms began to move, on seeing which Don Quixote shouted out again, "Although you should wield more arms than had the giant Briareus, I shall make you pay for your insolence." Saying this, and commending himself most devoutly to his lady Dulcinea, whom he desired to aid him in this peril, covering himself with his buckler, and setting his lance in rest, he charged at Rocinante's best gallop, and attacked the first mill before him. Thrusting his lance through the sail, the wind turned it with such violence that it broke his weapon into shivers, carrying him and his horse after it, and having whirled them round, finally tumbled the knight a good way off, and rolled him over the plain sorely damaged. Sancho Panza hastened to help him as fast as his ass could go, and when he came up he found the knight unable to stir, such a shock had Rocinante given him in the fall. "Bless me," said Sancho, "did I not tell you that you should look well what you did, for they were none other than windmills, nor could any think otherwise unless he had windmills in his brains." Peace, friend Sancho, said Don Quixote, for the things of war are constantly changing, and I think this must be the work of the same sage Freston who robbed me of my library and books, and he hath changed these giants into windmills to take from me the glory of the victory. But in the end his evil arts shall avail but little against the goodness of my sword. May it prove so, said Sancho as he helped his master to rise and remount Rocinante, who, poor steed, was himself much bruised by the fall. The next day they journeyed along towards the pass of La Pice, a romantic spot, at which they arrived about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Here, said Don Quixote to his squire, we may hope to dip our hands up to the elbows in what are called adventures. But take note of this, that although thou seest me in the greatest dangers of the world, thou art not to set hand to thy sword in my defence, unless those who assault me be base or vulgar people. If they be knights, thou mayest not help me. I do assure you, sir, said Sancho, that herein you shall be most punctually obeyed, because I am by nature a quiet and peaceful man, and have a strong dislike to thrusting myself into quarrels. Whilst they spoke thus, 2 friars of the order of Saint Benedict, mounted on large mules, big enough to be dromedaries, appeared coming along the road. They wore travelling masks to keep the dust out of their eyes, and carried large sun umbrellas. After them came a coach with 4 or 5 a horseback travelling with it, and 2 lackeys ran hard by it. In the coach was a Biscayan lady who was going to Seville. The friars were not of her company, though all were going the same way. Scarcely had Don Quixote espied them than he exclaimed to his squire, "Either I much mistake, or this should be the most famous adventure that hath ever been seen, for those dark forms that loom yonder are doubtless enchanters who are carrying off in that coach some princess they have stolen. Therefore I must with all my power undo this wrong." "This will be worse than the adventure of the windmills," said Sancho. "Do you not see that they are Benedictine friars, and the coach will belong to some people travelling?" "I have told thee already, Sancho," answered Don Quixote, "that thou art very ignorant in the matter of adventures. What I say is true, as thou shalt see." So saying, he spurred on his horse, and posted himself in the middle of the road along which the friars were coming, and when they were near enough to hear him, he exclaimed in a loud voice, "Monstrous and horrible crew! Surrender this instant those exalted princesses whom you are carrying away in that coach, or prepare to receive instant death as a just punishment of your wicked deeds." The friars drew rein and stood amazed at the figure and words of Don Quixote, to whom they replied, "Sir Knight, we are neither monstrous nor wicked, but 2 religious men, Benedictines, travelling about our business, and we know nothing about this coach or about any princesses." "No soft words for me," cried Don Quixote, "for I know you well, treacherous knaves." And without waiting for their reply, he set spurs to Rocinante, and laying his lance on his thigh, charged at the first friar with such fury and rage that if he had not leaped from his mule he would have been slain, or at least badly wounded. The second friar, seeing the way his companion was treated, made no words but fled across the country swifter than the wind itself. Sancho Panza, on seeing the friar overthrown, dismounted very speedily off his ass and ran over to him, and would have stripped him of his clothes. But 2 of the friar's servants came up and asked him why he was thus despoiling their master. Sancho replied that it was his due by the law of arms, as lawful spoils gained in battle by his lord and master, Don Quixote. The lackeys, who knew nothing of battles or spoils, seeing that Don Quixote was now out of the way, speaking with those that were in the coach, set both at once upon Sancho and threw him down, plucked every hair out of his beard, and kicked and mauled him without mercy, leaving him at last stretched on the ground, senseless and breathless. As for the friar, he mounted again, trembling and terror-stricken, all the colour having fled from his face, and spurring his mule, he joined his companion, who was waiting for him hard by. While this was happening, Don Quixote was talking to the lady in the coach, to whom he said, "Dear lady, you may now dispose of yourself as you best please, for the pride of your robbers is laid in the dust by this my invincible arm. And that you may not pine to learn the name of your deliverer, know that I am called Don Quixote of the Mancha, knight-errant, adventurer, and captive of the peerless and beauteous Lady Dulcinea of Toboso. And in reward of the benefits you have received at my hands, I demand nothing else but that you return to Toboso, there to present yourself in my name before my lady, and tell her what I have done to obtain your liberty." All this was listened to by a Biscayan squire who accompanied the coach. He, hearing that the coach was not to pass on, but was to return to Toboso, went up to Don Quixote, and, laying hold of his lance, said to him, "Get away with thee, Sir Knight, for if thou leave not the coach, I will kill thee as sure as I am a Biscayan." "If," replied Don Quixote haughtily, "thou wert a gentleman, as thou art not, I would ere this have punished thy folly and insolence, caitiff creature." "I know, gentlemen," cried the enraged Biscayan. "Throw down thy lance and draw thy sword, and thou shalt soon see that thou liest." "That shall be seen presently," replied Don Quixote, and flinging his lance to the ground, he drew his sword, grasped his buckler tight, and rushed at the Biscayan. The Biscayan, seeing him come on in this manner, had nothing else to do but to draw his sword. Luckily for him, he was near the coach, whence he snatched a cushion to serve him as a shield, and then they fell on one another as if they had been mortal enemies. Those that were present tried to stop them, but the Biscayan shouted out that if he were hindered from ending the battle, he would put his lady and all who touched him to the sword. The lady, amazed and terrified, made the coachman draw aside a little, and sat watching the deadly combat from afar. The Biscayan, to begin with, dealt Don Quixote a mighty blow over the target, which, if it had not been for his armor, would have cleft him to the waist. Don Quixote, feeling the weight of this tremendous blow, which had destroyed his visor and carried away part of his ear, cried out aloud, "O Dulcinea, lady of my soul, flower of all beauty, help thy knight, who finds himself in this great danger." To say this, to raise his sword, to cover himself with his buckler, and to rush upon the Biscayan was the work of a moment. With his head full of rage, he now raised himself in his stirrups, and, gripping his sword more firmly in his two hands, struck at the Biscayan with such violence that he caught him a terrible blow on the cushion, knocking the shield against his head with tremendous violence. It was as though a mountain had fallen on the Biscayan and crushed him, and the blood spouted from his nose and mouth and ears. He would have fallen straightway from his mule if he had not clasped her round the neck. But he lost his stirrups, then let go his arms, and the mule, frightened at the blow, began to gallop across the fields, so that after 2 or 3 plunges it threw him to the ground. Don Quixote leaped off his horse, ran towards him, and setting the point of his sword between his eyes, bade him yield, or he would cut off his head. The lady of the coach now came forward in great grief and begged the favor of her squire's life. Don Quixote replied with great stateliness, "Truly, fair lady, I will grant thy request, but it must be on one condition, that this squire shall go to Toboso and present himself in my name to the peerless Lady Dulcinea, that she may deal with him as she thinks well." The lady, who was in great distress, without considering what Don Quixote required, or asking who Dulcinea might be, promised that he should certainly perform this command. "Then," said Don Quixote, "on the faith of that pledge I will do him no more harm." Seeing the contest was now over, and his master about to remount Rocinante, Sancho ran to hold his stirrups, and before he mounted, taking him by his hand, he kissed it and said, "I desire that it will please you, good my lord Don Quixote, to bestow on me the government of that island which in this terrible battle you have won." To which Don Quixote replied, Brother Sancho, these are not the adventures of islands, but of crossroads, wherein nothing is gained but a broken pate or the loss of an ear. Have patience a while, for the adventures will come whereby I can make thee not only a governor, but something higher." Sancho thanked him heartily, and kissed his hand again and the hem of his mailed shirt. Then he helped him to get on Rocinante and leaped upon his ass to follow him. And Don Quixote, without another word to the people of the coach, rode away at a swift pace and turned into a wood that was hard by, leaving Sancho to follow him as fast as his beast could trot. Chapter 7. Of what passed between Don Quixote and the goatherds, and of the unfortunate adventure with the Yanguesian carriers. As they rode along, Don Quixote turned to his squire and said to him, "Tell me now, in very good earnest, didst thou ever see a more valorous knight than I am throughout the face of the earth? Didst thou ever read in histories of any other that hath or ever had more courage in fighting, more dexterity in wounding, or more skill in overthrowing?" "The truth is," replied Sancho, "that I have never read any history whatever, for I can neither read nor write. But what I dare wager is, that I never in my life served a bolder master than you are, and I only trust that all this boldness does not land us within the four walls of the gale." "Peace, friend Sancho," said Don Quixote. "When didst thou read of a knight-errant that was brought before the judge, though he killed ever so many people?" "I have read nothing, as you know, good master. But a truce to all this. Let me attend to your wound, for you are losing a good deal of blood in that ear, and I have got some lint and a little white ointment in my wallet." "That," said Don Quixote, "would have been unnecessary if I had remembered to make a bottle full of the balsam of Fierabrás, for with only one drop of it both time and medicines are saved." "What balsam is that, then?" asked Sancho Panza. "It is a balsam, the receipt of which I have in my memory, and whoever possesses it need not fear death nor think to perish by any wound. Therefore, after I have made it and given it unto thee, thou hast nothing else to do but when thou shalt see that in any battle I be cloven in twain, then deftly to take up the portion of the body which is fallen to the ground, and put it up again on the half which remains in the saddle, taking great care to fix it exactly in the right place. Then thou shalt give me 2 draughts of the balsam I have mentioned, and I shall become as sound as an apple." "If that be true," said Sancho, "I renounce from now the government of the promised island, and will demand nothing else in payment of my services but only the receipt of this precious liquor." "But tell me, is it costly in making?" "With less than 3 reals," said Don Quixote, "a man may make 3 gallons of it. But I mean to teach thee greater secrets than this, and do thee greater favors also. And now let me dress my wound, for this ear pains me more than I would wish." Sancho took out of his wallet his lint and ointment to cure his master, but before he could use them Don Quixote saw that the visor of his helmet was broken, and he had like to have lost his senses. Setting his hand to his sword, he cried, "I swear an oath to lead the life which was led by the great Marquis of Mantua when he swore to revenge the death of his nephew Baldwin, which was not to eat off a tablecloth, nor to comb his hair, nor to change his clothes, nor to quit his armor, and other things which, though I cannot now remember, I take as said, until I have had complete revenge on him that hath done this outrage." "Look, your worship, Sir Don Quixote," said Sancho when he heard these strange words, "you must note that if the Biscayan has done what you told him, and presented himself before my lady Dulcinea of Toboso, then he has fully satisfied his debt and deserves no other penalty unless he commits a new fault." "Thou hast spoken well and hit the mark truly," answered Don Quixote, "and therefore in respect of that I set the oath aside. But I make it and confirm it again that I will lead the life I have said, until I take by force another helmet as good as this from some other knight." "Such oaths are but mischief," said Sancho discontentedly, "for tell me now, if by chance we do not come across a man armed with a helmet, what are we to do?" do but consider that armed men travel not these roads, but only carriers and wagoners, who not only wear no helmets, but never heard them named all the days of their life. Thou art mistaken in this, said Don Quixote, for we shall not have been here 2 hours before we shall see more knights than went up against Albraca to win Angelica the Fair. So be it, said Sancho, and may all turn out well for us, that the time may come for the winning of that island which is costing me so dear. Have no fear for thine island, Sancho Panza, said Don Quixote, and now look, if thou hast aught to eat in thy wallet, for soon we should go in search of some castle where we may lodge the night and make the balsam of which I have spoken, for in truth this ear of mine pains me greatly. I have got here an onion and a bit of cheese and a few crusts of bread, but such coarse food is not fit for so valiant a knight as your worship. How little dost thou understand the matter, replied Don Quixote, for it is an honor to knights errant not to eat more than once a month, and if by chance they should eat, to eat only of that which is next at hand. And all this thou mightest have known hadst thou read as many books as I have done. For though I studied many, yet did I never find that knights errant did ever eat but by mere chance, or at some costly banquets that were made for them, and the remainder of their days they lived on herbs and roots. Therefore, friend Sancho, let not that trouble thee which is my pleasure, for to a knight errant that which comes is good. Pardon me, sir, said Sancho, for since I can neither read nor write, as I have already told you, I have not fallen in rightly with the laws of knighthood. But from henceforth my wallet shall be furnished with all sorts of dried fruits for your worship, because you are a knight, and for myself, seeing I am none, I will provide fowls and other things which are better eating. So saying, he pulled out what he had, and the two fell to dinner in good peace and company. But being desirous to look out for a lodging for that night, they cut short their meagre and sorry meal, mounted at once a horseback, and made haste to find out some dwellings before night did fall. But the sun and their hopes did fail them at the same time, they being then near the cabins of some goatherds. Therefore they determined to pass the night there. And though Sancho's grief was great to lie out of a village, yet Don Quixote was more joyful than ever, for he thought that as often as he slept under the open heaven, so often did he perform an act worthy of a true knight-errant. They were welcomed by the goatherds very cordially, and Sancho, having put up Rocinante and his ass the best way he could, made his way towards the smell given out by certain pieces of goat's flesh which were boiling in a pot on the fire. And though he longed that very instant to see if they were ready, he did not do so, for he saw the goatherds were themselves taking them off the fire and spreading some sheepskins on the ground, and were laying their rustic table as quickly as might be. Then with many expressions of good will they invited the two to share in what they had. Those who belonged to the fold, being 6 in number, sat round on the skins, having first with rough compliments asked Don Quixote to seat himself upon a trough which they placed for him, turned upside down. Don Quixote sat down, but Sancho remained on foot to serve him with the cup which was made of horn. Seeing him standing, his master said, "That thou mayest see, Sancho, the good which is in knight-errantry, and how fair a chance they have who exercise it to arrive at honor and position in the world, I desire that here by my side, and in company of these good people, thou dost seat thyself, and be one and the same with me that am thy master and natural lord. That thou dost eat in my dish, and drink in the same cup wherein I drink. For the same may be said of knight-errantry as is said of love, that it makes all things equal." "Thanks for your favor," replied Sancho, "but I may tell your worship that provided I have plenty to eat, I can eat it as well and better, standing and by myself, than if I were seated on a level with an emperor." And indeed, if I speak the truth, what I eat in my corner without ceremony, though it be but a bread and onion, smacks much better than turkey-cocks at other tables, where I must chaw my meat leisurely, drink but little, wipe my hands often, nor do other things that solitude and liberty allow. For all that, said Don Quixote, here shalt thou sit, for the humble shall be exalted. And taking him by the arm, he forced his squire to sit down near himself. The goatherds did not understand the gibberish of squires and knights-errant, and did nothing but eat, hold their peace, and stare at their guests, who with great relish were gorging themselves with pieces as big as their fists. The course of flesh being over, the goatherds spread on the skins a great number of parched acorns and half a cheese, harder than if it had been made of mortar. The horn in the meantime was not idle, but came full from the wineskins and returned empty, as though it had been a bucket sent to the well. After Don Quixote had satisfied his appetite, he took up a fistful of acorns, and beholding them earnestly, began in this manner: Happy time and fortunate ages were those which our ancestors called golden, not because gold, so much prized in this our iron age, was gotten in that happy time without any labors, but because those who lived in that time knew not these two words, thine and mine. In that holy age all things were in common. No man needed to do aught but lift up his hand and take his food from the strong oak, which did liberally invite them to gather his sweet and savory fruit. The clear fountains and running rivers did offer them transparent water in magnificent abundance, and in the hollow trees did careful bees erect their commonwealth, offering to every hand without interest the fertile crop of their sweet labors. Thus did the eloquent knight describe the golden age, when all was peace, friendship, and concord, and then he showed the astonished goatherds how an evil world had taken its place, and made it necessary for knights-errant like himself to come forward for the protection of widows and orphans, and the defense of distressed damsels. All this he did because the acorns that were given him called to his mind the golden age. The goatherds sat and listened with grave attention, and Sancho made frequent visits to the second wineskin during his discourse. At length it was ended, and they sat round the fire, drinking their wine and listening to one of the goatherds singing, and towards night, Don Quixote's ear becoming very painful, one of his hosts made a dressing of rosemary leaves and salt, and bound up his wound. By this means, being eased of his pain, he was able to lie down in one of the huts and sleep soundly after his day's adventures. Don Quixote spent several days among the goatherds, and at length, when his wound was better, he thanked them for their hospitality, and rode away in search of new adventures, followed by the faithful Sancho. They came to a halt in a pleasant meadow rich with beautiful grass, by the side of a delightful and refreshing stream, which seemed to invite them to stop and spend there the sultry hours of noon, which were already becoming oppressive. Don Quixote and Sancho dismounted, and leaving Rocinante and Dapple loose to feed on the grass that was there in plenty, they ransacked the wallet, and without any ceremony fell to eating what they found in it. Sancho had neglected to tie up Rocinante, and, as luck would have it, a troop of Galician ponies belonging to some Yanguesian carriers, whose custom it is to rest at noon with their teams in spots and places where grass and water abound, were feeding in the same valley. It must be believed that Rocinante supposed that the grass the ponies were feeding on was better than his own, but be that as it may, he started off at a little swift trot to feed among them. They resented his appearance, and as he sought to enter their ranks and feed among them, they received him with their heels and teeth, with such vigor that in a trice he had burst his girth, and his saddle was stripped from his back. But the worst of all was that the carriers, taking part with their own ponies, ran up with stakes and so belabored him that they brought him to the ground in a sore plight. Upon this Don Quixote and Sancho, who witnessed the basting of Rocinante, came running up all out of breath, and Don Quixote said to Sancho, From what I see, friend Sancho, these be no knights, but base rascally fellows of low breeding. I say this, that thou mayest freely aid me in taking vengeance for the wrong which they have done to Rocinante before our eyes. What vengeance can we take, replied Sancho, when there are more than 20, and we are but 2, nay, perhaps but 1.5? I count for 100, said Don Quixote, and without further parley he drew his sword and flew upon the Yanguesians, boldly followed by Sancho Panza. With his first blow, Don Quixote pierced a buff coat that one of them wore, wounding him grievously in the shoulder. Then the Yanguesians, finding themselves so rudely handled by 2 men only, they being so many, betook themselves to their stakes, and hemming in their adversaries in the midst of them, they laid on with great fury. In fact, a second thwack brought Sancho to the ground, and the same fate soon befell Don Quixote, whose dexterity and courage availed him nothing, for he fell at the feet of his unfortunate steed, who had not yet been able to arise. Then, seeing the mischief they had done, the Yanguesians loaded their team with as much haste as possible, and went their way, leaving the adventurers in a doleful plight and a worse humor. Chapter 8. How Don Quixote arrived at an inn which he imagined to be a castle, and there cured himself and Sancho with the balsam of Fierabras. For some time after the Yanguesian carriers had gone on their way, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza lay on the ground groaning and saying nothing. The first that came to himself was Sancho Panza, who cried in a weak and pitiful voice, "Sir Don Quixote! O Sir Don Quixote! What wouldst thou, brother Sancho?" Answered Don Quixote in the same faint and grievous tone as Sancho. "I would, if it were possible," said Sancho Panza, "that your worship should give me a couple of mouthfuls of that balsam of Fierabras, if so be that your worship has it at hand. Perhaps it will be as good for broken bones as for wounds." "If I had it here," sighed Don Quixote, "we should lack nothing. But I swear to thee, Sancho Panza, on the faith of a knight-errant, that before 2 days pass, unless fortune forbids, I will have it in my possession." "I pray you," asked Sancho, "in how many days do you think we shall be able to move our feet?" "I cannot say," said the battered knight, "but I take on myself the blame of all, for I should not have drawn my sword against men that are not knights. Therefore, brother Sancho, take heed of what I tell thee, for it mightily concerns the welfare of us both, and it is this, that when thou seest such rabble offer us any wrong, wait not for me to draw sword upon them, for I will not do it in any wise, but put thou thy hand to thy sword, and chastise them at thy pleasure." But Sancho Panza did not much relish his master's advice, and replied, "Sir, I am a peaceable, sober, and quiet man, and can let pass any injury whatever, for I have a wife and children to take care of. Therefore let me also say a word to your worship, that by no manner of means shall I put hand to sword either against clown or against knight. And from this time forth I forgive whatever insults are paid to me, whether they are or shall be paid by persons high or low, rich or poor, gentle or simple." On hearing this, his master said, "Would that I had breath enough to be able to speak easily, and that the pain I feel in this rib were less, that I might make thee understand, Sancho, the mistake thou art making. How can I appoint thee governor of an island, when thou wouldst make an end of all by having neither valor nor will to defend thy lands or revenge thine injuries?" "Alas," groaned Sancho, "I would that I had the courage and understanding of which your worship speaks, but in truth at this moment I am more fit for plasters than preachments. See if your worship can rise, and we will help Rocinante, although he deserves it not, for he was the chief cause of all this mauling. Fortune always leaves one door open in disasters, and your Dapple will now be able to supply the want of Rocinante and carry me hence to some castle where I may be healed of my wounds." Nor shall I esteem such riding a dishonor, for I remember to have read that old Silenus, tutor and guide of the merry god of laughter, when he entered the city of 100 gates, rode very pleasantly, mounted on a handsome ass." "That may be," replied Sancho, "but there is a difference between riding a horseback and being laid athwart like a sack of rubbish." "Have done with your replies," exclaimed Don Quixote, "and rise as well as thou art able, and sit me on top of thine ass, and let us depart hence before the night comes and overtakes us in this wilderness." Then Sancho, with 30 groans and 60 sighs and 120 curses, lifted up Rocinante, who, if he had had a tongue, would have complained louder than Sancho himself, and after much trouble set Don Quixote on the ass. Then tying Rocinante to his tail, he led the ass by the halter, and proceeded as best he could to where the highroad seemed to lie. And fortune, which had guided their affairs from good to better, led him on to a road on which he spied an inn, which to his annoyance and Don Quixote's joy must needs be a castle. Sancho protested that it was an inn, and his master that it was a castle, and their dispute lasted so long that they had time to arrive there before it was finished, and into this inn or castle Sancho entered without more parley with all his team. The innkeeper, seeing Don Quixote laid athwart of the ass, asked Sancho what ailed him. Sancho answered that it was nothing, only that he had fallen down from a rock, and had bruised his ribs somewhat. The innkeeper's wife was by nature charitable, and she felt for the sufferings of others, so she hastened at once to attend to Don Quixote, and made her daughter, a comely young maiden, help her in taking care of her guest. There was also serving in the inn an Asturian wench, broad-cheeked, flat-pated, with a snub nose, blind of one eye and the other not very sound. This young woman, who was called Maritornes, assisted the daughter, and the two made up a bed for Don Quixote in a garret which had served for many years as a straw loft. The bed on which they placed him was made of 4 roughly planed boards on 2 unequal trestles, a mattress which, in thinness, might have been a quilt, so full of pellets that if they had not through the holes shown themselves to be wool, they would to the touch seem to be pebbles. There was a pair of sheets made of target leather, and as for the coverlet, if anyone had chosen to count the threads of it, he could not have missed one in the reckoning. On this miserable bed did Don Quixote lie, and presently the hostess and her daughter plastered him over from head to foot, Maritornes holding the candle for them. While she was plastering him, the hostess, seeing that he was in places black and blue, said that it looked more like blows than a fall. Sancho, however, declared they were not blows, but that the rock had many sharp points, and each one had left a mark, and he added, "Pray, good mistress, spare some of that toe, as my back pains are not a little." "In that case," said the hostess, "you must have fallen too." "I did not fall," said Sancho Panza, "but with the sudden fright I took on seeing my master fall, my body aches as if they had given me 1,000 blows, and I now find myself with only a few bruises less than my master, Don Quixote." "What is this gentleman's name?" asked Maritornes. "Don Quixote of the Mancha," answered Sancho Panza, "and he is a knight-errant, and one of the best and strongest that have been seen in the world these many ages." "What is a knight-errant?" asked the wench. "Art thou so young in the world that thou knowest it not?" answered Sancho Panza. "Know then, sister mine, that a knight-errant is a thing which in 2 words is found cudgelled, and an emperor. Today he is the most miserable creature in the world, and the most needy. Tomorrow he will have 2 or 3 crowns of kingdoms to give to his squire." "How is it then," said the hostess, "that thou hast not gotten at least an earldom, seeing thou art squire to this good knight?" "It is early yet," replied Sancho, "for it is but a month since we set out on our adventures. But believe me, if my master Don Quixote gets well of his wounds, or his fall, I should say, I would not sell my hopes for the best title in Spain." To all this, Don Quixote listened very attentively, and sitting up in his bed as well as he could, he took the hostess's hand and said, Believe me, beautiful lady, that you may count yourself fortunate in having entertained me in this your castle. My squire will inform you who I am, for self-praise is no recommendation. Only this I say, that I will keep eternally written in memory the service you have done to me, and I will be grateful to you as long as my life shall endure. The hostess, her daughter, and the good Maritones remained confounded on hearing the words of the knight-errant, which they understood as well as if he had spoken in Greek, but yet they believed they were words of compliment, and so they thanked him for his courtesy and departed, leaving Sancho and his master for the night. There happened to be lodging in the inn that night one of the officers of the Holy Brotherhood of Toledo, whose duty it was to travel the roads and inquire into cases of highway robbery. He, hearing some time later that a man was lying in the house sorely wounded, must needs go and make an examination of the matter. He therefore lighted his lamp and made his way to Don Quixote's garret. As soon as Sancho Panza saw him enter arrayed in a shirt and a nightcap with the lamp in his hand, which showed him to be a very ugly man, he asked his master, "Will this by chance be some wizard Moor come to torment us?" "A wizard it cannot be," said Don Quixote, "for those under enchantment never let themselves be seen." The officer could make nothing of their talk, and came up to Don Quixote, who lay face upwards encased in his plasters. "Well," said the officer roughly, "how goes it, my good fellow?" "I would speak more politely if I were you," answered Don Quixote. "Is it the custom in this country, lout, to speak in that way to a knight-errant?" The officer, finding himself thus rudely addressed, could not endure it, and, lifting up the lamp, oil and all, gave Don Quixote such a blow on the pate with it that he broke his head in one or two places, and, leaving all in darkness, left the room. "Aha!" groaned Sancho, "this is indeed the wizard Moor, and he must be keeping his treasures for others, and for us nothing but blows." "It is ever so," replied Don Quixote, "and we must take no notice of these things of enchantment, nor must we be angry or vexed with them, for since they are invisible, there is no one on whom to take vengeance. Rise, Sancho, if thou canst, and call the constable of this fortress, and try to get him to give me a little wine, oil, salt, and rosemary to prepare the health-giving balsam, of which I have grievous need, for there comes much blood from the wound which the phantom hath given me." Sancho arose, not without aching bones, and crept in the dark to where the innkeeper was, and said to him, "My lord constable, do us the favor and courtesy to give me a little rosemary, oil, wine, and salt, to cure one of the best knights-errant in the world, who lies yonder in bed sorely wounded at the hands of a Moorish enchanter." When the innkeeper heard this, he took Sancho Panza for a man out of his wits, but nevertheless gave him what he wanted, and Sancho carried it to Don Quixote. His master was lying with his hands to his head, groaning with pain from the blows of the lamp, which, however, had only raised two big lumps, what he thought was blood, being only the perspiration running down his face. He now took the things Sancho had brought, of which he made a compound, mixing them together and boiling them a good while until they came to perfection. Then he asked for a phial into which to pour this precious liquor. But as there was not one to be had in the inn, he decided to pour it into a tin oil vessel which the innkeeper had given him. This being done, he at once made an experiment on himself of the virtue of this precious balsam, as he imagined it to be, and drank off a whole quart of what was left in the boiling pot. The only result of this was that it made him very sick indeed, as well it might, and what with the sickness and the bruising and the weariness of body, he fell fast asleep for several hours, and at the end of his sleep awoke so refreshed and so much the better of his bruises that he took himself to be cured, and verily believed he had hit upon the balsam of Furibras. Sancho Panza, to whom his master's recovery seemed little short of a miracle, begged that he might have what was left in the boiling pot, which was no small quantity. Don Quixote consenting, he took the pot in both hands and tossed it down, swallowing very little less than his master had done. It happened, however, that Sancho's stomach was not so delicate as his master's, and he suffered such terrible pains and misery before he was sick that he thought his last hour was come, and cursed the balsam and the thief who had given it to him. Don Quixote, seeing him in this bad way, said, I believe, Sancho, that all this evil befalleth thee because thou art not dubbed knight, for I am persuaded that this balsam may not benefit anyone that is not. If your worship knew that, replied poor Sancho, bad luck to me and mine, why did you let me taste it? Before Don Quixote could reply to this, Sancho became so terribly sick that he could only lie groaning and moaning for 2 hours, at the end of which he felt so shaken and shattered that he could scarcely stand, and sadly wished that he had never become squire to a knight-errant. Chapter 9. How Sancho paid the reckoning at the inn which Don Quixote supposed was a castle. Now, whilst Sancho Panza lay groaning in his bed, Don Quixote, who, as we have said, felt somewhat eased and cured, made up his mind to set off in search of new adventures. And full of this desire, he himself saddled Rocinante and put the pack-saddle on his squire's beast, and helped Sancho to dress and to mount his ass. Then getting a horseback, he rode over to the corner of the inn, and seized hold of a pike which stood there, to make it serve him instead of a lance. All the people that were staying at the inn, some 20 in number, stood staring at him, and among these was the innkeeper's daughter. Don Quixote kept turning his eyes towards her and sighing dolefully, which everyone, or at least all who had seen him the night before, thought must be caused by the pain he was in from his bruises. When they were both mounted and standing by the inn gate, he called to the innkeeper and said in a grave voice, Many and great are the favours, Sir Constable, which I have received in this your castle, and I shall remain deeply grateful for them all the days of my life. If I am able to repay you by avenging you on some proud miscreant that hath done you any wrong, know that it is my office to help the weak, to revenge the wronged, and to punish traitors. Ransack your memory, and if you find anything of this sort for me to do, you have but to utter it, and I promise you, by the order of knighthood which I have received, to procure you satisfaction to your heart's content. Sir Knight, replied the innkeeper with equal gravity, I have no need that your worship should avenge me any wrong, for I know how to take what revenge I think good when an injury is done. All I want is that your worship should pay me the score you have run up this night in mine inn, both for the straw and barley of your 2 beasts, and your suppers and your beds. This, then, is an inn? Exclaimed Don Quixote. Ay, that it is, and a very respectable one too, replied the innkeeper. All this time, then, I have been deceived, said Don Quixote, for in truth I thought it was a castle, and no mean one. But since it is indeed an inn, and no castle, all that can be done now is to ask you to forgive me any payment, for I cannot break the laws of knights-errant, of whom I know for certain that they never paid for lodging or aught else in the inns where they stayed. For the good entertainment that is given them is their due reward for the sufferings they endure, seeking adventures both day and night, winter and summer, afoot and a horseback, in thirst and hunger, in heat and cold, being exposed to all the storms of heaven and the hardships of earth. All that is no business of mine, retorted the innkeeper. Pay me what you owe me, and keep your tales of knights-errant for those who want them. My business is to earn my living. You are a fool and a saucy fellow, said Don Quixote angrily, and, spurring Rocinante and brandishing his lance, he swept out of the inn-yard before anyone could stop him, and rode on a good distance without waiting to see if his squire was following. The innkeeper, when he saw him go without paying, ran up to get his due from Sancho Panza, who also refused to pay, and said to him, Sir, seeing I am squire to a knight-errant, the same rule and reason for not paying at inns and taverns hold as good for me as for my master. The innkeeper grew angry at these words, and threatened that if he did not pay speedily, he would get it from him in a way he would not like. Sancho replied that by the order of knighthood which his lord and master had received, he would not pay a penny though it cost him his life, but his bad fortune so managed it that there happened to be at the inn at this time 4 wool-combers of Segovia, and 3 needle-makers of Cordova, and 2 neighbors from Seville, all merry fellows, very mischievous and playsome. And as if they were all moved with one idea, they came up to Sancho, and pulling him down off his ass, one of them ran in for the innkeeper's blanket, and they flung him into it.